If during the service or the study you don't want to be filmed, you are welcome to turn your video cameras off. However, for our safety of the community, when you first log on, if you can turn your video on for a bit, just so we know who you are, and so we all know who's in the room together, that would be great. And at the end, just so we can visually check in with you to see how you're doing, make sure everything is okay. Now, I wanted to give you a definition. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration defines any setting as trauma-informed if the people there realize how widespread trauma is, recognize signs and symptoms, respond by integrating knowledge into practice, and resist doing further harm. They further identify 6 principles of trauma-informed approaches: safety, trustworthiness, empowerment, collaboration, peer support, and valuing and supporting diversity in history and culture. Here at the Laboratory Church, we do align with these principles, and we definitely recognize the widespread trauma in our culture, from individual experiences to systemic abuse. As a church, we do not seek to replace therapy, but instead we seek to add another space where we can work on relational healing and building healthy relationships with one another. Now, in regards to safety, we admit that safety is a two-way street and it's a relational container, and that everything we do contributes to the safety of one another. And because there's differences between us, which are all amazing and beautiful, there will sometimes be things that might not feel as safe. So in that space, we would ask for grace and communication so that we can learn from each other how to make each other feel safe going forward. So if you are ever triggered, we will invite you to let us know, and we will stay online with you, have a phone conversation with you. We never want anyone to ever feel upset when they leave. We want to be able to be with you and see how we can help you get back to your normal state. With that being said, we're also going to try and do content warnings or kind of statements with what we're talking about. And Ellen will be talking about trauma today, so I am turning it over to her.
Good evening, everybody. So great to see you here. I am going to do part 2 of Holy Saturday in the Aftermath of Trauma, and there will be a part 3 of Holy Saturday in the Aftermath of Trauma. But the idea here is, last week or last time we met as a study lab, we talked a bit about Holy Saturday and that part of the title. This week, we're going to talk a little bit more about what trauma means. It's a specific kind of lens that we're going to be using. And then hopefully in the third study, we will begin to put all of this together to come up with, or to really explore, something known as a sort of a trauma theology. What is a good thing to do at any time. And I have had the privilege or pleasure of, now I've had 2 intensive 4-day intensives with the Center for Mind Body Wellness. But one of the things they've taught me is whenever you start anything, a meeting, so let's just take a few minutes to take a couple of deep breaths together to settle ourselves and move our mind to be present with each other and in the space together. Sit up straight or lay down straight or wherever you are. Open up your chest so that you can feel the air coming in. And just after you do that, begin to just focus on your breathing. Notice that you're breathing. Notice your breathing, and you can maybe soften your eyes. You can close your eyes if that's helpful. What you might do is take a deeper, longer in-breath. So count maybe 3 or 4 seconds in. And notice 3 or 4 seconds out. You're trying to get your mind focused on your body and your body focused on your breath coming in and out. Depending if we have some time and anybody's game, there's various types of meditation, but there's expressive meditation as well. So I might show you a brief example of what it is to shake and dance your trauma away. There's a couple here that were not here last time, but I will just briefly talk about what we talked about last study lab. And that is, we talked about the notion of Holy Saturday as the space between death and resurrection. And the emphasis there was the question of how can we as Christians, and even as people trying to read and understand the Bible, how can we honor the time and the space between the traumatic event and the so-called beginning of the transformation into new life? The theory I was operating under is that it's really contrary to what the gospel is written to rush from the death to the resurrection. We love to say, oh, that was a bad event, but it'll get better. Or Jesus died, but lo and behold, he rose again. And we forget the middle part. We forget about Holy Saturday. We forget that there's a need to transform from one place to another. We also talked about, where was Jesus during this time? Was he dead? Was he in the midst of something known as hell? And we also sort of talked about, had he gone up to the Father and come back? But I noticed something, Carol, in last week's gospel passage, where Jesus told the disciples, I have not yet ascended to the Father. And that was in the passage Amie read, or actually Jody read for us in our worship service. And we learned last week that recovering from a traumatic event is a process. And sometimes it can feel like hell. So hell as a place where Jesus is, and hell as a metaphor for what happens when we're traumatized, seems to work. Today, I'm going to talk about trauma more from the literal medical, psychological definitions of trauma, because I don't want us all to be operating under different notions of what trauma is or just what it feels like to you, because when people write about trauma, they're writing from a very specific set of understandings. So these become terms of art rather than merely what we think trauma is. And it's, as I talked about last time, there's a science that underlies all this. But for our purposes, the definition that I like to use is trauma is a violently inflicted psychological wound with lasting adverse impact, and or it is any experience where individuals fear that their life or their psychological integrity is threatened. So let me look at this slightly differently. So even though we might call a car accident a trauma, and medically any injury that results from the violent infliction of force is a medical injury known as a trauma, what we're really talking about is the impact of the event on the person. And here's what I mean by that. So a car accident, we go, oh yeah, the car accident was a trauma. The car accident is not the trauma. The question is whether the person who was in the car accident or watched the car accident experienced any psychological sense of lack of safety or impairment to their life. And I had a patient like this. You might be in a car accident, it doesn't bother you in the least, right? You walk away, you go, okay, safe, fine. You go get your wounds fixed, you go on. That is not a trauma then. And I'm not going to make you think it's a trauma. But maybe you have 3 more car accidents, and each time you feel more and more like your life is threatened, and now you fear going out in the road in your car at all. Now the accident has become a traumatic event for you, because over time you feel like your life is threatened, and you also feel unsafe because you're like wondering, what's this pattern of accidents that's happening? You see the difference? This is where the subjective nature of trauma is important. Something that's traumatic to me may not be traumatic to you, okay? But there are events that are traditionally thought to cause, or are more likely to cause, this kind of trauma response. And we know them. Natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, accidental injuries, car accidents, you trip and fall and you break your leg. There are workplace accidents that can have tremendous impact. But then we have sort of what is the intentional injuries, right? Abuse, domestic or childhood, violent rape, assaults, stabbings, sometimes self-inflicted wounds, people who witness any of those events. And what we know is that there is a compounding effect, so that people who may have one event are susceptible when further events happen to be more likely to suffer the traumatic effects or responses that are known as the psychological injury or trauma effect. Okay, so the more often it happens, the more vulnerable you are to having this sense of psychological injury and having a very vivid sense that your sense of safety is really impaired. Now, what I want to note here before we go on about the crucifixion, and to remind everyone, the Romans, their empire, used crucifixion as an intentional infliction of trauma on the entire community. They made it public and they left the people there so that the community would see this violent event, that it would instill fear in the community and suppress any desire on the part of the community to attack or to resist the empire. So when the Romans placed Jesus on the cross, it is an intentional act designed not only to hurt Jesus and whoever else was put on the cross with him, but it's a very intentional signal to the people surrounding Jesus that you don't mess with the empire. And it does have a very effective tool for crowd control. Let me just put it that way, an extremely effective tool. So let's talk about why, or what happens to us when we witness a trauma and why it creates a problem for us. Give you a little background science, neuroscience, physiology, okay? So you understand why trauma has a lasting impact on the body. So all of us are made with a number of different nervous systems and responses in the brain. The oldest nervous system is known as the reptilian system. It's a system we inherited from the mammals and the reptiles that preceded us. It's the system that lets animals survive. So that's why we sometimes call it the reptilian, but it's our autonomic nervous system. There's also something called the vagal nerve, but I'm not going to get into that this moment, but it's also an ancient one that we inherit before we inherit our rational thinking, the frontal lobe that makes us a bit different than the animal, okay? That system is designed to work in nanoseconds. It will work faster than we can perceive the reality in our frontal lobe. And the reason for that is when the lion is chasing us, we don't really have a lot of time, and I think I talked about this last time, to wonder, is that really a lion or not? We just need to do something. And the three defense systems we're built with are fight, flight, or freeze. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into two parts. There is the sympathetic nervous system, and I'll get back to that. That's one half. And there's the parasympathetic nervous system. And human beings who are fully balanced on these two systems, we're great, okay? What trauma does is it will cause an imbalance in these systems. So for instance, to remember what the sympathetic nervous system does, sympathetic, think of step on the gas, okay? What that does is when we are sense that we're in danger, our heart rate increases, our breathing rate increases, we start to conserve our energy so that we can, flee as fast as we can. So it's the part of the system that controls heart rate. Cortisol starts getting pumped into our system so that we, you've heard these stories of people picking up entire cars to rescue children under cars. That's because of that sympathetic step on the gas of our system so we can respond in that way. the parasympathetic nervous system is designed to put on the gas, parasympathetic nerve, or the peace system, the speed system, the peace system. So it's the one that's going to cause us to lower our blood pressure, to lower our temperature, to calm our system down. So the freeze response is when the parasympathetic nervous system is on high gear and it has damped everything down to the point where we're not moving or mobile. So we either have fight, flight, or freeze. When we experience trauma, whatever way we responded, our body remembers that response. And so the next time it experiences something similar, that response turns on. But we can be mistaken. So this we know about combat veterans who are suffering from the most severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Combat, they knew to duck and hide. But now they're walking with their wife to the grocery store and a car backfires. They pull her and themselves down to the ground. Their sympathetic nervous system thought that the sound was a signal as if they were back in combat. But it's kind of a misfire. It's doing what it should do. It's protecting them, but they misperceived whether threat is there. And once sometimes these systems get embedded in your system, you can't tell what is perceived real danger versus perceived danger versus something that sounds like but isn't the fearful thing. So any questions so far? So we are hardwired to respond like that. One of the keys in working with people with trauma is to calm that system down that's out of balance or put it back in balance so people can get to their rational brain and think things through rather than emote things through. So, you know, it's a hard thing to understand because on the one hand, these systems are designed to really help preserve us and animals, right? On the other hand, they can interfere in a way that is not helpful. So I'm going to go through each of these: fight, flight, or freeze. And I want you to tell me if there's something you know about the story from Holy Thursday through the resurrection that resembles any of these, okay? Reactions by the disciples. Now, this time we're going to focus more on the witnesses rather than Jesus himself. Fight. Anybody have a fight response? Benita?
Whoever cut the ear off.
Right, Peter.
Here.
Boom. They're
Sorry,
sleeping
Peter.
in the garden. Nothing's wrong. They don't know. Jesus may know something's coming. You know, maybe this takes the judgment off. They don't know something's coming. They're like hanging out. And as soon as he sees those soldiers, out comes a sword. Boof. That's the fight response to a traumatic, to an event that threatens his safety. Excellent. Flight.
I think someone dropped his clothes and ran away naked at that point.
We have such biblical scholars. Mark 14:50. Then this is in the Bible. Then everyone deserted him and fled. They grabbed one young man who had been wearing a linen cloth, which they tried to grab, but he pulled free and ran away naked.
And this isn't like a physical fight, but when Peter denies Jesus the 3 times.
Right. And I thought about that. Is that
And like, I don't know
or
if
is
that's
that
fight or
freezing?
freeze, but I feel like
Yeah.
so, but I was thinking maybe it's more flight because like he didn't like just like freeze and.
Yeah, I was on the flight path. I think I moved to freeze path because when he's confronted with, you know, Jesus, he goes, which I think we can be, if we're this isn't trying to be literal or, you know, you're not getting graded on this, but yeah, I think we can argue that's part of a freeze response. He's like, whoa. And then of course they all go into hiding, right? But we're gonna go through that part of the passage of the gospel very carefully as we talk about a few more things. So now you can begin to see that these things that we know now neurologically, right, have been identified by science. The story as it's written 2000, whatever years ago, those responses are in that story by the disciples. What begins, so medical science, neurobiology, psychology have begun to identify things that are indicative of someone having they call it a stress response, or are under a traumatic stress response, or acute stress response, or could be simply what I call continuing to be under the influence of the traumatic event, certainly particularly within hours or days of that event. And so I'm going to list some of these for us. Some of you might want to write them down. And what we're going to do is kind of go through the people who witnessed this and see, did we see any evidence of this in the text that Amie read last week, right? Because what we're trying to see now is trauma as we understand it now, but they didn't understand it then, just happened to be in the Bible. And these symptoms can be, for some people, very temporary, right? Within 3 or 4 days or a month or so, they're fine. Some of them linger for a period of weeks or more. What psychologists and psychiatrists and folks like Thaddeus do for mental health purposes, if these symptoms last 30 or more days and they impair the functioning of the individual, they begin to look to see, you can't diagnose someone with PTSD without a 30 or more days passing. So the kind of symptoms you're going to see are disorientation, confusion, anxiety, forgetfulness or repression, lack of memory of the event, inability to sleep or eat, developing fears or fearfulness, like you don't want to get in a car after an accident, or you don't want to drive along the same highway ever again that you had an accident on, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance. People who've been traumatized tend to always be on the lookout for actual perceived threat. I am always on the lookout for actual perceived threat. What happens is that becomes problematic when we perceive danger when there is no real danger. That's that body getting the switch up I talked about before. Is everybody okay as I talk about this? Anybody? So what we're going to do, but we're going to look at a couple of the passages, and Amie could, if she wants to put it up, I'm going to start from like 20 verse 11, and I'm not going to go through everything, but just to give us an example, let's read a little bit of what we listened to last week. And if you hear any of those symptoms or evidence that those symptoms might be impacting the person, I just want you to raise your hand. You don't have to explain it, I'll believe you, but we're going to count how many times something that sounds like a response to trauma is occurring in this passage. Mary stood outside near the tomb crying. Thank you. As she cried, she bent into the tomb. She saw 2 angels in white. The angels asked her, "Woman, why are you crying or weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid them." Anyone think that's evidence of confusion or disorientation? Okay, there's another one. When she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, there's some confusion. "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Then Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him, "Rabboni." Then he says, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my Father's." And I'm going to skip the next 2 verses. He says, "I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Then she runs to the disciples, says, "I've seen the Lord," and she told them he had seen these things. 19, when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the wound, Verse 24, but Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. Where's he? Hiding, maybe? They say to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Denial. the next verses, and that's what's on the lectionary for today. Verses 26, where Jesus appears and says, I'm going to show you my scars, my wounds. So how many hand raises do we get in those few verses?
A bunch.
Might it be fair to say that the level of anxiety, confusion, denial, disorientation is very high after this traumatic event and before the resurrection? How might that make us feel towards the disciples, or differently towards the disciples than maybe we have felt before?
Maybe have more empathy for why they would run away and why they might be scared.
Yeah, and can we expand that into community as we look at that relationship?
You want to say more about that?
Can we look at one another in that with that same lens?
Yes, right. And that's one of the key things about understanding what trauma is really about, and how these responses, if you now understand the physiology, their disorientation and confusion is in some ways not their response, but it is exactly the way the body should have responded in an event of that nature. You will hear that theme in the book Body Keeps the Score. You will hear that theme through a lot of these newer sort of folks who focus on trauma, that you become less judgmental about people. Like, what do you mean Thomas wasn't even with them? Where was he? Oh, good Lord, he didn't want to be associated with them in community, and he didn't want to be associated. He's off scared. I'm reading this, Kennedy, in the chat. Thank you. Aha, I like that. Yes, I think that is an important point, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is why were the women better able to stay with Jesus through the trauma? And I think that, Kennedy, you've stumbled upon the key to why we call our spiritual ministry the Mary Magdalene ministry. Because in the face of the fear, she continued to be a witness to Jesus, who she was in relationship with, not as a source of power, but because Jesus had taken care of her, she took care of Jesus, and she had these demons expelled, but she had more space to be with Jesus one way or the other. And one of the things we'll be talking about next week a lot about is the notion of witness in the face of trauma.
It seemed that culturally, the men were more concerned about the competition, and the women are socialized to care. So it's kind of like today we raise our boys up to be the best ball player, the best soldier, the best doctor, the best whatever, and we raise our girls up to be the best homemaker
And caretaker.
and caregiver, which is a support role. And so I see the gender roles being reinforced in those stories also.
Absolutely. And I think that, yeah, anybody else like to reflect here? Because I think Kennedy's opened up really a ripe area of discussion. Not only having gained some resilience, there's a notion of post-traumatic growth. So Kennedy's mentioning maybe because they've been so traumatized and before, they may have also had a period of growth and ability to handle it. It also may have to do with the nature of the relationship.
I think that, again, culturally, the state of competition demands that the male distance himself from emotional intelligence. So when trouble comes, the ability to stay grounded is a lot tougher when everything that you've pretty much constructed in your world is that it's a fallacy. And when real things happen, you have no basis of reaction except the trauma, response a lot of times.
The other things to know about trauma literature and psychology, just to get this sort of down, is the notion of wounds. And we'll talk more about this next time, but I want to drop a little teaser. Trauma remains embedded in the body. So telling people to get over their trauma is about the most counter-logical thing we know now. It's contrary to science, in fact. It's also contrary, perhaps, to the Bible. When Jesus returned, he carried his own wounds with him. And he sort of forced all the disciples in both vignettes that we read to look at the wound. So in trauma theory, Judith Herman would say, and many people have adopted it in many fashions in there is, to help traumatized people, you first have to create a sense of safety. So that's why we try to remind people about content warnings and different things that happen in this. Not that we think we're going to do something terrible, but we never know what's going to actually traumatize someone. 2, how do we help people have remembrance and mourning? And a lot of that requires us to continue to be willing to sit with somebody in their mess, right? Instead of running away or circumventing around it. Can we sit with the person and witness to their stuff and affirm it as opposed to denying it? Does that ring true for anybody? And then is the development of the relational piece. So sort of Jesus coming back into the fold and trying to talk to them at different spaces may be his beginning of the development of relationship. And then the disciples and his followers in the Acts of the Apostles learned they better build community to be together in light of the resurrection.
I think one of the key takeaways from Jesus coming back to share the wounds is to relieve some of the trauma response, because actually the reactivity is able to be reduced by a dose of reality. And by Jesus being more real at that point, then the psychological spinning that's happening can slow down or even stop. And that's kind of what I was trying to get to last week in the mental health moment, is that trauma has this perceptive swing to it. You know, like you said, there's a false hypervigilance that makes you protectionist even when you don't need to be. So you're kind of scrambling, your mind is racing and you're calculating from this side and from this side. So having a relationship that's safe, that you can trust, allows your psychology to stop swinging, trying to measure what's really going on in that exchange. And that's what we're doing here as a group of people coming together safely to say to one another, even if it's just in being still, you're not alone, you're not crazy. Like, I'm actually here and you're actually having these swings and it's okay. And when all of that slows down or stops, I'll still be in the same place. And that's really the magic, is being able to be locatable to that psychology as it's searching for the ground again.
And I think that kind of gives more understanding to Thomas wanting to touch the wound, because he was like, okay, am I imagining this? I mean, I know what happened, and here I am, like, when we see something that we can't explain, I mean, of course you want reality. And, if you've had a totally different reality presented and then it flips on its head, you're like, what?
Yeah, that's what we classically call shock.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of trauma is a shock response, and that I have to see it. I have to put my hand on it or touch it, or, we see folks lose a person and they can't believe it. They have to go touch the person. They have to make sure. That is a shock trauma response as well. I agree with that.
The shock goes back to the crucifixion, which intentionally inflicted this fear that threatened their life and their own psychological integrity. Up until that moment, they thought Jesus was going to be with them forever. And they're about to go on this journey. And it's done.
Yeah, if this is God and now God has been crucified in front of you, that's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
What you said earlier about witnessing trauma is traumatic too, because, when you witness a shooting, when you witness any type of terrorist activity, from the people shooting up shopping malls, and, even we were talking about lynching, that's totally terroristic, and it's totally meant to inflict trauma on people to make them do what the fear mongers tell them to do, keep you in your place, So yeah, I mean, we definitely know in this country what it's like to go against the empire and what happens.
Right. And if anybody has watched any of the witnesses testifying at the trial,
Sure.
those people have been traumatized for the rest of their life. I mean, the damage is not murder, but the damage is anybody who had to go through that and they couldn't stop it. That's also a key feature of when somebody's traumatized and when somebody is not traumatized, is there was nothing they could do to stop it. Any questions? I'm going to stop here, allow you to ask some questions, some thoughts that have come to mind. Some observations.
This has been helpful. And what I was wondering, I have often, when I have heard stories from personal stories from people about why they left the denomination that displays the crucifix, and growing up as a child, since I did not grow up with that image all the time, I did not understand until today that you explained that constant trauma of seeing Jesus is almost, you're constantly there. So this makes me a better counselor or listener where we're inflicted with that.
Yes. Yes. Jill?
Well, we've mentioned this before, and I really latched onto your phrase, the rush to resurrection. And I so appreciate us delving into this because I think in my Christian upbringing, that was always so confusing to me that we didn't discuss the whole crucifixion and the story of the resurrection from this light, because it is a very traumatic experience. And I know why denominations don't, and they gloss over that and rush to the resurrection. So I really, really appreciate having this discussion because for me, it's been a long time coming and having, a group of people that are willing to talk through that and to appreciate the horror really, of that crucifixion and the infliction upon Jesus and the aftermath of everyone around them.
Thank you.
I think Jesus tried to help us by saying the prayer, forgive them for they know not what they do, not only to cover our active will, but our submissive will when we're triggered. Because a lot of times when we're having a trauma response, we're doing things that are breaking relationship. And so I think that was part of Jesus interceding for us.
In the denomination I was brought up in, we never explored those 3 days that Jesus was supposedly dead before he rose again. I did not ever hear anything about him going to Hades and spending time. That's a totally new thing for me, and I need to explore that. So if anyone can suggest some readings for me on that, I'd appreciate it.
I'll get some to send it out. Anyone else? Please speak up if there's anyone else. What I think we want to know is it's all not bad news, that in fact, there are also ways to counteract the effects of trauma. And that's what we as a church are trying to learn to do. It's not just to learn to recognize it, but to learn some of the practices that help us. And one of them you've talked about, whether it's Benita or Jill or anyone here, the empathy piece gets greatly expanded for ourselves and for others. After I read The Body Keeps the Score, I had far more empathy for myself for a lot of times when I'd gotten really angry at stuff that maybe I shouldn't. I was like, I can't, and then I do it again. I'd be like, I can't believe I did it again. I've told myself, calm down. And then I had to learn, mechanisms to really try to, once you know the trigger and you know it, you can start to work on it. So if you all are game, we're going to do a little shaking and dancing, because one of the ways you counteract the stuff in your body is to get rid of it, right? The good news is that we can overcome our traumas in community through relationship and through the practice of various techniques. There's no question we've all undergone a similar trauma, and that's called COVID and isolation and all that. And that's certainly something we can make space to talk about.
You know, Ellen, you mentioned some DSM criterion for diagnosis. And what's so interesting about the medical community is a lot of the reactivity that we have, justifiably so, like things that happen in real life that are really upsetting for real. They'll give you a pill for that if you feel that in a prolonged type of way. And so what I think I hear you saying is that in community, some of the edge is taken off when you feel safe and, in connection and surrounded by people who, if not think like you, are willing to engage with you and negotiate space. So because I'm so passionate about what we're actually talking about, and I know that healing power of being still for someone who's in a reactive state, because they're trying to come back down to reality. And if you can just be a true north for them, let's just put it that way, if you can be a true direction that they can find from wherever they are, it does have a way of settling down, all of that firing.
And that's why, in our statement of values, we talk about honesty, authenticity, vulnerability, because, when you get the most growth in your relationship, when the person that you're in relationship with allows you to have a meltdown, allows you to freak out and be completely irrational about something, and you are just there saying, you know what, I feel that. And you're not judging them, you're not putting a label on them. And they know that, like, even if one of us got in an argument with the other, if we can then get past that to communicate, oh, you know what, I heard you say this and I felt this. And then the person could say, well, oh, I meant this. And then you have a chance to come together. And the more that we continue to be present with each other, when we have an argument, a disagreement, a freak out that's unrelated to the other person, that presence is what creates the safety. It lets people know I'm not going to run away the second that it gets hard. And we'll all mess up from time to time. I mean, that's simply inevitable.
But I mean, the grown-up thing to do is stay in there, stick in there. And, like I said, negotiate that space and keep the people. When I'm in therapy with folks, I talk about, either we're going to be right or we're going to be together. And I also talk about, do we want to keep issues or do we want to keep one another? This has to be stated. This has to be an actual thing at the beginning, because some folks, they just want to be right. And they'll carry that banner until the wheels fall off, as they say. But I think it's only fair to the other person that's attached to them in that room to hear initially if they're interested in actually doing a dance that works for them. I think that's, the person should know where they stand.
And that's where the negotiation of boundaries comes in, because, while I say we should be present with people when they're freaking out or having their meltdown, we do also have to be safe for ourselves. So we should also be able to communicate to someone who is making us feel unsafe. You know what? I do still love you. However, when you say this to me in this tone of voice, I feel like, whatever thing. And that's hard to do. It requires so much strength to be able to tell someone, stop hurting me. And that is necessary because it's always a two-way street.
I think Pastor Amie and Thaddeus, we are finished with part 2. Thank you for the opportunity to do this. And if you like this, share the videos and spread the good news of the Laboratory Church.